Korean brands, entertainment, and culture as a whole have influenced the world in an undeniable way over the past generation. Their success across multiple industries could be regarded as even more impressive when considering their humble and troubled modern history. In 1960, South Korea's global nominal GDP ranking was number 31, with a GDP per capita of $158 per year, far below the global average of $457 per year, making it one of the poorest regions in the world. By 2022, South Korea had climbed in the nominal GDP rankings to number 13, with a GDP per capita of over $32,000 per year, about 2.5 times the global average, an unprecedented level of growth. And what's even more impressive is that they achieved this feat with only half of the original Goryeo kingdom still intact. North Korea today has a nominal GDP roughly 1/10 the size of their divorced counterpart to the south, having isolated themselves from much of the global arena, re-earning Korea's Joseon dynasty's 17th century nickname, the Hermit Kingdom, due to the nation's favoritism towards isolationist policies. After nearly a century of crippling invasions from Japan's Toyotomi regime, China's Jing dynasty, and China's Qing dynasty in the 16th and 17th centuries. Japan annexes the peninsula and ends Korea's long history as an independent state. While it can be argued that Korea saw significant economic growth during the colonial period, Japan is the main benefactor of Korea's industrialization. Much of the improved infrastructure in the colony is used to extract resources from Korea to support the Japanese economy. From a cultural and moral perspective, Japanese rule over Korea leaves an immeasurable impact on the Korean populace's pride and identity. Tens of thousands of Korean historical artifacts are relocated to Japan. The Korean language is banned, and many Koreans are forced to take on Japanese names. It is estimated that during World War II, over 500,000 Korean men are forced into involuntary labor, with a death rate of around 10% due to dangerous and negligent working conditions. And perhaps most infamously, an unknown number of Korean women and girls, usually between the ages of 12 to 17, are forced or coerced to work at Japanese military brothels as comfort women. The 20th century for Korea is a tough century, to say the least. As the world enters into the modern era, with European colonization and Japanese and Chinese expansionism growing rapidly in East Asia, it's not surprising that a relatively small nation like Korea would be swiftly gobbled up. Which makes it all the more interesting that for over 2,000 years, this peninsula, living directly in the shadow of some of the most powerful empires the world has ever known, maintained its independence and cultural identity, even in the face of a giant, all the way through the present day. How'd they do it? Well, let's talk about it, brah. To preface this video, there isn't a definitive answer to how Korea maintained its political and cultural independence from China. This is an extremely complex topic that has nuances and intricacies to the history of the nation and its relationship with the rest of the world. As such, we can only analyze what limited knowledge we know of the past and theorize why history trajected in the direction it did. When referring to Korea in this video, we will view and refer to it not as two separate nations as it is today, but rather in its last dynastic form prior to Japanese colonization, the Kingdom of Joseon. Korean culture, while very much unique with its own rich indigenous history, is inexorably connected to the cultures of the Yellow River Basin before there was even the concept of what we call China today. The powerful kingdoms of the Yellow River were major regional powers in East Asia and exerted influence on the countless historical kingdoms and tribes throughout modern-day China, as well as neighboring kingdoms outside of China's borders today. These interactions spread ideological and cultural influences rooted in Buddhism, Taoism, and most importantly, Confucianism, arguably the most influential pillar in East Asian thought, which heavily influences the hierarchical relationship between individuals. The foundation of Confucian doctrine revolves around filial piety within the family unit, which is mirrored on a communal scale in the obedience of subjects towards their rulers. Though this social structure has received criticism throughout Asia in the 21st century with the widespread introduction of democracy, Confucian values are still apparent in work and home environments, even in politically and economically free countries like South Korea. In order for us to better understand how Korean culture survived into the modern era, we need to look back at its origins and its relationship with China. A common theme in ancient Korean history is a continued stream of migration and invasions into Korea from the various dynasties and kingdoms of the Yellow River Basin, but also instances of significant migrations and invasions from Korea into China. But before the beginnings of Chinese influence, Korea had its own indigenous foundation history. Gojoseon, Korea's first kingdom, is said to have been established in 2333 BCE by Dangun, a man to have descended directly from heaven. Throughout Korean history, Dangun has been revered as the figure of Korean nationalism that played a major role in the spiritual independence movements against Chinese, Mongolian, and Japanese colonization of Korea, insinuating that Koreans are a heavenly race, having descended from the grandson of heaven. For some Koreans, this idea went as far as becoming one of Korea's main indigenous religions, Dangun-kyo. While Gojoseon would be Korea's first and most powerful kingdom, it did not have unfettered dominance over the peninsula for long. In the 12th century BCE is where the first recorded direct relationship between China and Korea begins. Gija, or Jizi in Chinese, the uncle of King Zhou, the last king of China's Song dynasty, purportedly founded Gija Joseon, the succeeding kingdom to Dangun's Gojoseon. Though some historians believe Gojoseon lived on, coexisting alongside Gija Joseon for many years. In pre-modern Korea, Gija represents the authenticating presence of Chinese civilization, and until the 12th century, Koreans commonly believed that Dangun bestowed upon Korea its people and basic culture, while Gija gave Korea its high culture and presumably standing as a legitimate civilization. Modern historians question the existence of both Dangun and Gija, arguing that while they may be loosely based around real historical figures, the details of the mentioned stories are widely accepted as semi-mythological. But the value of their stories is in the focus on the intertwined relationship between China and Korea in their early histories. It's important to note at this point that the ancient borders of the Korean peninsula and modern-day China are unrecognizable by today's standards, and are not distinctly unified nations. They are comprised of kingdoms of varying sizes, and territorial boundaries are fluid year to year. This is an important fact in helping us answer the main question of this video, which we will touch more on later. The first mentions of Gojoseon are found in Chinese historical records of Guanzi during China's Warring States period. This is an important note as Korea is not yet dealing with a unified China. In fact, the concept of what we consider China today is not even close to being established, as the kingdoms of China have yet to be unified under one banner by the Qing dynasty, which would not occur for another 2 centuries following the Zhou dynasties. This is an era of never-ending alliances and betrayals between the 7 kingdoms of the Yellow River Basin. Think Game of Thrones, but the dragons don't have wings. The purported reaches of Gojoseon encompass modern-day northwest Korea. Directly to the south is the Kingdom of Jin. The degree of political organization of Jin is unclear. It seems likely that it was a federation of small states. However, there is some evidence of some stable centralized governance, as the Western Han dynasty records Jin emissaries being welcomed to the imperial court. To the east is the Kingdom of Ye, a relatively small chiefdom tribal state with a shrouded history. To the north is Okjil, another tribal kingdom that has likely never been fully centralized and is heavily controlled and influenced by Gojoseon. A large part of Gojoseon's dominance in Korea during this era is due to its proximity to the kingdoms of China. The diffusion of Chinese science, political structure, and technologies, particularly iron technology, is extremely valuable. Highlighting this fact is Gojoseon's continued efforts at cutting off the Jin's kingdom's attempts at developing direct ambassadorial relations with the Han dynasty, deterring Jin ambassadors from traveling through Gojoseon lands, which is the most direct route between Jin and Han China. The kingdoms of the Yellow River Basin are, for the first time, unified under the Qing dynasty, and China enters into the imperial era. This is an important turning point in Korea's history because it is no longer dealing with various fragmented, albeit powerful kingdoms to its west, but a single centralized empire. The looming shadow casted over Korea grows larger, and while Qing rule would be short-lived relative to many later dynasties, its effects would be immeasurably significant, as there now more than ever develops the concept of China as a singular ethnicity and high culture that believes it is destined to conquer and civilize barbarians outside their borders under the mandate of heaven. General Weiman, or Weiman in Chinese, of the Yan Kingdom escapes to Gojoseon as a refugee during Qing's conquest of the Yellow River Valley. King Jun of Gojoseon, impressed by Weiman's military prowess, appoints him as an officer in today's Liaodong Peninsula. Weiman gradually adopts Korean tradition and clothing over the years of service under King Jun, and gains popularity amongst both Chinese refugees and local Koreans throughout the region. He eventually gains a following large enough to usurp King Jun and takes power in Gojoseon. Here's where our story really starts to spice up. Weiman's grandson, King Ugyo of Gojoseon, sparks conflict when he refuses to let Gojoseon's southern neighboring state, Jin, send its ambassador through Gojoseon's territory in order to reach the Han dynasty. Hey, you are letting me through! In response, Han China sends its ambassador, Se He, to Gojoseon to negotiate Jin's right of passage through Gojoseon lands. King Ugyo refuses the emperor's requests and sends his son, Prince Weijiang, to escort the ambassador back to China. However, when they approach close to Han's borders, Ambassador She He assassinates the Korean prince and claims to Emperor Wu that he has defeated Gojoseon in battle. The Han emperor, unaware of this deception, promotes She He to military commander of the commandery of Liaodong. The outraged King Ugyo swiftly organizes a raid on Liaodong and kills She He to avenge his son. In response, Emperor Wu commissions a two-pronged attack, one by land and one by sea against Gojoseon. The two forces attacking are initially unable to coordinate well with each other and suffer heavy losses. Eventually though, the commands successfully merge, and the capital of Gojoseon, Wanggyom, falls in 108 BCE. The story of Korea's greatest kingdom up through this point comes to an end. The Han dynasty takes control over Gojoseon lands and establishes the four commanderies of Han in the northern half of Korea. The commanderies stretch from modern-day southern Manchuria in the north to the Han River in the south. Only Lelong Commandery sees any form of stable Chinese governance, as the other three commanderies prove relatively unsuccessful against regular Korean resistance movements. Prior to this point, Korea had had political leaders that had descended from China, but now, for the first time, has lands that are actually incorporated into a Chinese dynasty and report and answer to the imperial court. This brought about an influx of Chinese migrants and culture into the Korean peninsula like never before, as prior to this, the majority of Chinese influence into Korea largely occurred organically through cultural diffusion and migration, rather than through organized military conquest. Under the protection of the commanderies, large numbers of settlers from the states of Yen and Qi settle in the former Gojoseon lands. Most of China's military activity in Korea is centralized in the north. In the south, on the other hand, Chinese influence trickles in more indirectly, with limited influence of the commanderies over the southern chiefdom states. Byeonhan, Jinhan, and Mahan kingdoms emerge around the time of the fall of the Gojoseon and would be known as Samhan, or Three Kingdoms. Not to be confused with the later Three Kingdoms period in China and the Three Kingdoms in Korea in the 3rd and 7th centuries. While most of the Western world uses the nation's exonym Korea, the Han in Samhan is the origin of the nation's endonym Hanguk, or Great Nation. Back in the Han capital, a general Wang Mang leads a rebellion to overthrow the Han dynasty. The Yellow River Basin devolves into anarchy. Wang Mang's rebellion against the Han is successful, but his Qing dynasty is short-lived, lasting from only 9 AD to 23 AD, before Emperor Guangwu restores order in the empire under the new Eastern Han dynasty in 25 AD. Wang Tiao, a general in Korea, uses this opportunity to stage a rebellion to succeed from Han. In 30 AD, with the return of relative stability in China, the rebellion in Korea is quelled by Wang Zun. The commandery once again returns under the direct control of China. However, the shortage of human resources caused by the turmoil results in the abolishment of the 7 eastern prefectures. Much of the administration of the Lelong commandery is left to the Dongye natives, whose chiefs are often conferred as Korean aristocrats to the Chinese. As we can see through the ever-changing borders on our maps, the concept and identity of Korea is difficult to grasp and hold down in a static form. For much of its history up through this point, the northern, southern, western, and eastern segments of the peninsula are independent of one another, with the northwest arguably being more closely related culturally and politically to China than it is to its counterparts throughout the rest of the peninsula. Dialects and cultures are independent of one another, and even in the northwest, in the heart of the occupied Lelong commandery, there is a constant ebb and flow of Chinese control depending on the level of centralized strength of Han China and the Korean kingdoms at each given year. When there is turmoil within Korea or China, power is handed back to local chiefs to act more so as independent tributaries than actual subjects to the emperor. Oftentimes, imperial influence is but a whisper in a loud and chaotic land. To convolute things even further, many kingdoms like Buyo and Goguryeo exist in territories that are what is now present-day Northeast China, Manchuria, Russia, and Korea. If a person today were to go back in time to these kingdoms and try to label these cultures, languages, and people using our notion of distinctly Korean, Chinese, or even Manchurian, it would be nonsensical. The cultures exist in proto-forms that would go on to heavily influence all people in this northeast region of Asia, transcending present-day nationalities. In fact, around this time, there are 2 major language families in Korea. In the north, you have Puyo, which is spoken throughout Buyo, Goguryeo, Dongye, and Okjo, while in the south, you have the Han languages, which are spoken throughout Mahan, Byonhan, and Jinhan. Let's not whip out our tinfoil hats just yet, but is it a little bit suspicious that this historical language line is so similar to the 38th parallel? This fact could lend credence to the idea that at this time, Northern Koreans are culturally and linguistically more similar to Northeastern Chinese than they are to Southern Koreans. This leads us to our first reason for Korea's ability to maintain its independent identity. The concept of China and Korea seem natural to us today, but the reality is that for much of history, kingdoms and empires within both China and Korea are going at it back and forth for millennia. The line of who identifies as Chinese or Korean is blurry, and even within both regions, individual groups are more likely to identify only with their own regional tribes or kingdoms. There are times in which much of northern Korea is occupied by groups originating from what is now China, and there are times in which much of Northeast China is occupied by groups originating from what is now Korea. So to ask the question of how Korea maintained its identity in the face of China is a much froggier question than one might think. Could you even consider Manchuria part of China during this era? Could you even consider northern and southern Korea as one ethnic group during this era? With all of these questions in mind, one might lean towards the conclusion that the early history of these two countries is not necessarily one of Korea fending off its bigger bully neighbor China, but an extremely complex soup of various groups vying for power and influencing each other in all directions. Shortly following the devastating Yellow Turban Rebellion and a series of incompetent emperors, the Eastern Han Dynasty is unable to fully recover and gradually crumbles, and China enters into the heavily romanticized period in East Asian history, the Three Kingdoms period, from 220 to 280 AD, where we see the tripartite division of China amongst the dynastic states of Cao Wei, Shu Han, and Eastern Wu. This is one of the most tumultuous periods in Asian history, with drama around every corner. Kings, generals, warlords, and politicians engage in a seemingly endless epic of alliances, betrayals, and even love triangles. For decades, it may have seemed China might never again be unified. All the while, back in Korea, a semi-nomadic tribal kingdom of Yemek tribes begins centralizing under a king in the 1st century BCE, and by the 3rd century AD would be fully formed into a powerful kingdom called Goguryeo that would play a major role in shaping Korea's history. Goguryeo exists in present-day Manchuria and northern Korea, a largely mountainous region with relatively poor cultivable lands. Upon centralizing, Goguryeo may have been unable to harness enough resources from the region to sustain its population, and thus, following historical pastoralist tendencies, would have sought to raid and exploit neighboring societies for their resources, promoting aggressive military expansion, allowing Goguryeo to exact tribute from their tribal neighbors and become the dominant force in Korea. This is an important factor that we'll touch more on later. With war raging in a fragmented China, Goguryeo is quickly pulled into the drama. The decorated general Sima Yi of the kingdom of Cao Wei, viewing the powerful Goguryeo as a valuable potential ally, creates an alliance against his rival, General Gongsun Yuan, also of Cao Wei. Gongsun Yuan is defeated, and though not titled emperor or king, Sima Yi for much of his political career is the primary authority in Cao Wei. The alliance between Goguryeo and Cao Wei is mutually beneficial. However, by 242, the relations begin to sour. King Dongchon, the 11th monarch of Goguryeo, despises the notion of the Chinese commanderies in Goguryeo lands. They are a monument to the Han dynasty's supremacy over Korea. Goguryeo, now an ally that aided in Sima Yi's ascension to power, should be viewed as an equal sovereign entity to Cao Wei, but the presence of the commanderies contradict the idea of equality. King Dongchon initiates a raid on former Goguryeo territories, now controlled by the Wei near the mouth of the Yalu River, ultimately leading to war. In 244, Cao Wei launches 2 successful campaigns against Goguryeo. During the first campaign, Chinese general Guan Qiujian leads 10,000 infantry and cavalry into Goguryeo and is met by King Dongchon's army of 20,000 at the Battle of Liangkou. After an extended period of back and forth fighting, Cao Wei decisively triumphs over Goguryeo forces, which finally ends with the sacking of the Goguryeo capital of Huandou in present-day Jilin and the resettlement of many of its inhabitants. Although Goguryeo is unable to defeat Cao Wei in battle, Chinese forces overextend themselves deep inside Korea and finally decide to withdraw. Goguryeo, while not completely annihilated, is relegated to the peripheries of history following the war, as Chinese chronicles do not mention the kingdom for another 50 years. In terms of historiography, the expeditions of the second campaign are significant for providing detailed information on the various Korean tribes and peoples of the Korean peninsula. The expedition, unprecedented in scale in the region during this era, brought first-hand knowledge about topography, climate, population, language, manners, and customs of these areas to Chinese cognizance, and was duly recorded in the Wei Lue. Though the original Wei Lue is now lost, its contents were preserved in the records of the Three Kingdoms, where the reports from the Goguryeo expedition are included in the chapter on Eastern barbarians. Considered the most important single source of information for the culture and society of early states and peoples on the Korean peninsula. Despite military successes, Cao Wei's campaigns failed to successfully colonize the majority of Korea. This leads us to the second reason for Korea's ability to maintain its independent identity: its peninsular geography. Surrounded by water on 3 sides, to the east is the Sea of Japan, to the west is the Yellow Sea, and to the south is the East China Sea. To the north, Korea shares a land border with China's provinces of Liaoning and Jilin, and Russia's federal subject Primorsky. Peninsulas are inherently defensive due to their limited access points. This natural advantage historically made them easier to protect from invasions or attacks, as they could be fortified more easily along the landward side, leaving fewer vulnerable entry points. In addition, like in the case of Cao Wei's invasion of Korea, supply and reinforcement lines are limited to coming from a singular direction when deep into a narrow peninsula. Korean defenders can more easily disrupt these lines relative to defending lands on open plains where supply lines can come from a wider range of directions. Defeating Korea in battle is one thing, but to maintain control over the peninsula is a completely different animal. In China, Cao Wei falls to their successor, the Jin dynasty, and Goguryeo, now under the rule of its 15th monarch, King Micheon, and having rebuilt much of its power in Korea, seizes the opportunity to attack the weakened Jin after it struggles to maintain peace in its young dynasty, and wrestles the commanderies away from Chinese control. With full domain over northern Korea and southern Manchuria, Goguryeo establishes itself as a true Korean empire, having integrated most of the tribes of Okjo and Dongye. 400 years of Chinese rule over Korea and Manchuria comes to an end. During the rule of Emperor Gwanggaeto the Great, he is remembered for his rapid military expansion of the realm. Gwanggaeto conquers 64 walled cities and 1,400 villages during his campaigns. To the west, he destroys neighboring Khitan tribes and invades later Yan, conquering the entire Liaodong Peninsula. To the north and east, he annexes much of Buyeo and conquers the Sushen, who are Tungusic ancestors of the Jurchens and Manchus. An impressive feat when considering that the two would both later go on to successfully conquer all of China in the Jing and Qing dynasties. To the south, he defeats and subjugates Baekje, contributing to the dissolution of Gaya, and vassalizes Shila. Gwanggaeto brings about a loose unification of the Korean peninsula. For the first time in its history, he achieves undisputed control over most of Manchuria, part of Inner Mongolia, and over 2/3 of the Korean peninsula, including what is now Seoul, bringing Goguryeo into a golden age. There is even possible archaeological evidence that Goguryeo maximum extent may have extended even further west into present-day Mongolia, based on discoveries of a possible Goguryeo fortress ruin. Some historians argue that during Gwanggaeto's height of power, Goguryeo may have been on equal standing with the powerful dynasties of the Chinese mainland. His son and successor Jiangsu moves the capital to Pyongyang in 427, a more suitable region to grow into a burgeoning metropolitan capital, which further continues Gogoryo's golden age of prosperity. A repeating trend in this video leading to the third reason for Korea's ability to maintain its independent identity from China is the cultural and geographic proximity of Korea, most notably Goguryeo, to the nomadic peoples who inhabit North Asia and the Central Asian steppe. Some of these peoples include but are not limited to Eastern Turks, Jurchens, Manchus, Gungusic, Sushen, Buyeo, Khitan, Xianbei, and Xiongnu. These groups, although looked down on as barbarians by the sedentary agricultural cultures of China, have from the beginning of East Asian history been an everlasting threat to the Chinese way of life. So much so that beginning from the 7th century BCE, Chinese civilizations would begin constructing a wall that would ultimately stretch over 13,000 miles in an attempt to keep these nomads out. The people of Goguryeo, although having very much adopted a sedentary agrarian way of life, similar to that of the people of the Yellow River Basin, has a deep-rooted connection to the nomadic way of life. In fact, as we mentioned earlier, Goguryeo's initial success in conquering its neighbors stemmed from its homeland in northern Korea and Manchuria having little fertile land, meaning a large number of early Korean inhabitants were living a predominantly pastoral lifestyle. And with the growth of their kingdoms came the necessity to pillage the resources of their neighbors to sustain their larger populations, a common practice of nomadic culture. And by no means a direct indication of connection between cuisine preference and nomadic lifestyle, but it's likely not a coincidence that regions that are known for barbecuing their food at the dining table, for example Mongolian barbecue, Japanese barbecue, and Korean barbecue, are also historically known to be nomadic or semi-nomadic cultures that ate on the move and relied on a meat-heavy diet. The significance in this connection between Korea's semi-nomadic history and its independence from China is that the Chinese, much like the Romans and Persians, historically had difficulty maintaining control over nomadic peoples, oftentimes being outright conquered by them entirely. Some of the advantages of having a semi-nomadic culture include nomadic groups often employ guerrilla warfare tactics, using hit-and-run strategies, ambushes, and raids. These tactics can be highly effective against conventional armies that are not adapted to fighting in the same manner, especially when it comes to supply lines into the narrow Korean peninsula, which we saw with Cao Wei's invasion of Goguryeo. Nomadic societies are accustomed to living in challenging conditions and are highly adaptable. They can quickly adjust their strategies, lifestyles, and routes to respond to changing circumstances, making them hard to predict and counter. Nomadic cultures may place a higher value on independence, self-sufficiency, and warrior traditions, leading to a strong determination to resist outside forces. Only 3 notable kingdoms remain on the Korean peninsula during the Three Kingdoms period, or Samhan in Korean: Goguryeo, Baekje, and Shilla, which would be the main 3 kingdoms that contribute to becoming what is modern-day Korea. Goguryeo controls the northern half of the peninsula, as well as the Liaodong Peninsula of Manchuria. Baekje and Shilla occupy the southern half of the peninsula. Now, for the first time more than ever, the Korean peninsula shares a common culture, language, and identity. The Book of Sui records,
The customs, laws, and clothes of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Shilla are generally identical. Their original religions appear to have been shamanistic, but they are increasingly influenced by Chinese culture, particularly Confucianism and Taoism.
At the same time, Korea is far from culturally harmonious as it existed in the 19th century. The material culture of the three kingdoms can be clearly distinguished as they display cultural influence from different regions. Goguryeo culture shows stronger influence from northern Chinese art. Baekje shows stronger influence from southern Chinese art, and Shilla, which is more distant from China, shows greater influence from Eurasian steppe nomadic cultures and greater preservations of native Korean traditions. The kingdom of Baekje, while historically much weaker than Goguryeo, is an invaluable piece of Korea's history and a key factor in the theme of our story. In addition to the peninsula's advantage of limiting the amount of land that needs to be defended against invasion, being surrounded by water on three sides also has a different advantage. Peninsulas can provide strategic advantages for naval power. They often have extensive coastlines, which can facilitate the construction of ports, shipyards, and naval bases. Being surrounded by water also pressures early cultures to extract resources from the sea, encouraging them to adopt seafaring technologies. As mentioned earlier, relationships with the states of China are extremely important to the relative power of each Korean kingdom, which is why Gojoseon and Goguryeo, having the most direct land route to China, work so diligently at preventing the southern and eastern kingdoms and tribes from having direct ambassadorial relations with China. Baekje, though cut off from China via land by Goguryeo, is strategically located directly across the Yellow Sea from the Asian mainland, incentivizing the kingdom throughout its history to rapidly develop their navy to circumvent the land route obstruction to China. Baekje, often described as the Phoenicia of East Asia, is renowned as a great maritime power. Through maritime trade and exploration, Baekje plays a fundamental role in transmitting culture and material developments to ancient Japan, including Chinese written characters, Chinese and Korean literature, technologies such as ferrous metallurgy and ceramics, architectural styles, sericulture, Confucianism, and Buddhism. Baekje, on a relatively small scale, even acts as a maritime colonizer, exerting its political influence on Tamna, a kingdom that rules Jeju Island, which ultimately becomes a tributary state to Baekje. This leads us to our fourth reason for Korea's success at maintaining its cultural identity. Not to say that the other Korean kingdoms' naval prowess was anything to sneeze at, but with the absorption of Korea's most powerful navy, Baekje's, Korea would ultimately become a serious naval player in the East Asian arena that is often very capable of holding its own against even the most powerful of Chinese dynasties on the high seas. This means that amphibious invasions of Korea from China are not as easy as one might think just judging based on the size of each nation. A testament to Korea's investment in maritime technology is the Korean turtle ship during the Joseon dynasty, a feared battleship design that resembled a turtle adorned with armor and spikes. In the 16th century, during the Battle of Sacheon, the turtle contributes to winning 16 battles against the Western Japanese fleets, who at the time had already grown to become a formidable naval power in Asia in their own right. Shilla is now the smallest and weakest of the three Korean kingdoms, but ends up playing perhaps the biggest role of the kingdoms in shaping Korean history. Shilla, much like Baekje, with the land route to China cut off in the north by their dominant neighbor Goguryeo, using sea routes heavily invests in its relationship with China, which is now ruled by the powerful and unified Tang dynasty. Goguryeo and Baekje, viewing Shilla's annexation of Gaya as an expansionist threat, ally with each other in an attempt to destroy Shilla. This proves to be a fatal mistake, as the Tang dynasty is regularly in border disputes and skirmishes with Goguryeo in the north. In 660 AD, after earning Tang China's favoritism in Korea, and after suffering repeated belligerent actions from Goguryeo Baekje forces, Shilla declares war against Baekje. Admiral Su Dingfang, commander of the Tang fleet, sails across the Yellow Sea and lands his army on the western coastline of Baekje. Tang troops march towards Sabi, the capital of Baekje. To complete the second half of the two-pronged attack, General Kim Yu-sin leads the 50,000-strong Shilla army past Baekje's eastern border across the passes of Tanhyeon towards Hwangsan Plain, where the Shilla army defeats Baekje forces. Tang and Shilla forces converge on the Baekje capital, where King Uija of Baekje surrenders. The Tang army takes the king, crown prince, and 93 officials back to Tang China to hold as hostages. Emperor Gaozong of Tang, instead of giving the Korean lands to Shilla or even dividing it up between the two victors, establishes 5 Chinese military administrations in the newly conquered lands, which King Muryol painfully accepts, an early indicator of the unavoidable conflict to come following the war. With their eyes now set on the ally-less Goguryeo, in 661 AD, General Pang Xiaotai of Tang marches 350,000 imperial soldiers overland into Goguryeo. Shilla, still recovering from the war against Baekje, is only asked to aid with supplies for the Tang army's invasion. Goguryeo, having ample time to prepare their defenses during Baekje's demise, withstands the siege of the Pyongyang capital for months. What was supposed to be the second half of a pincer attack on Goguryeo from the south fails, as Tang forces are slowed by restorationist rebels in Baekje. Making matters worse is the revolt in Tiele in the western edge of the Tang Empire, which forces the Tang Emperor to commit forces to his western front. Following the failed siege of Pyongyang, Tang forces are intercepted and defeated at Sasu River, a giant setback for Tang China, and an end to Tang's first Goguryeo campaign. Generalissimo Yonge So-moon, though not titled as king, has King Yonyu killed, and sits the late king's nephew into the throne as a puppet ruler, making Yon the de facto leader of Goguryeo. Following his death in 666 AD, a power struggle erupts with no clear hereditary line of succession, since Yon was not technically the king, and Goguryeo's centralized power weakens as various individuals fight for the throne. Generalissimo Yon's death paves an opportunity for Tang China to launch a second campaign against Goguryeo, this time with Shilla forces prepared to assist in invading from the south. In 668 AD, the Tang and Shilla forces besiege and conquer Pyongyang, leading to the fall of the Goguryeo Empire. A year later, Emperor Gaozong establishes the Protectorate General to pacify the east to control the former territories of Goguryeo. A subordinate office is placed in Baekje, and protectorates are even installed in Shilla. Shilla is humiliated, having been aided by the Tang to defend against Baekje and Goguryeo occupation, only to ultimately be occupied by the Tang themselves. King Munmu of Shilla begins assembling an army with a goal to expel the Tang dynasty from Shilla, former Baekje, and former southern Goguryeo lands to ensure the security of Shilla from Tang control. Despite such unfavorable odds against the mighty Tang Empire, Shilla has a few fortuitous advantages. Much of Tang's ability to wage war effectively on the peninsula is due to their armies being supplied by Shilla, which is now an enemy of the state. The local populations of the newly conquered Goguryeo and Baekje, while generally resentful towards their Shilla conquerors, are far more resentful towards the Tang occupiers, a foreign invading group whose capital and emperor sits over 1,000 miles away in Chang'an. The Shilla rulers share at least some common ground and kinship with the people of the Korean peninsula. The decorated military strategist and expansionist Emperor Gaozong begins ailing in health, and Empress Wu, who begins assuming imperial responsibilities, prefers for pacifist policies, and the Tang Empire begins diverting resources away from military expansion. Shilla is greatly supported by lasting revolts in Goguryeo and Baekje. By 671 AD, Shilla forces expel Tang forces from most of Baekje. By 674 AD, after years of back and forth fighting, both sides achieved successes throughout former Goguryeo lands. Having not lost any course-altering battles, King Munmu of Shilla unexpectedly decides to formally apologize to Emperor Gaozong and offers tribute to the Tang, unfitting Gaozong's history of ruthlessness towards those that would challenge his supreme authority without punishment. The emperor accepts the tribute and puts a halt to the violence for the time being. Very interestingly, many historians cite that the possible reason for this unusual behavior on both sides is due to Gaozong having been personal friends with King Munmu's father, the late King Muyor, when Gaozong was not yet emperor and they were both adolescents. This is likely part of the reason the Tang dynasty initially supported Shilla, which was also an unexpected move as Shilla was the weakest of the 3 Korean kingdoms during the Three Kingdoms period. Quite remarkable and fascinating how one unassuming relationship between 2 young men possibly influenced the entire course of history for 2 nations.
Did we just become best friends? Yep!
In 675 AD, however, relations once again turn hostile, and General Li Jingxing reaches Shilla territory via land through Manchuria. However, the Tang forces are defeated by a Shilla army at the Meiso fortress, in or near present-day Yonchon. In 676 AD, the Tang tries its luck again, this time through a naval attack under General Xue Rengui, crossing the Yellow Sea to reach Shilla. This naval campaign is also unsuccessful and results in a Shilla counterattack on the Engjing Commandery, the last remaining Tang outpost in Baekje's former territories. This forces the Tang to relocate the capital of the Protectorate General to pacify the east, farther north and west to the more easily defensible city of Liaoyang, effectively ending any Tang claims to Shilla-controlled territory. By the end of the Shilla-Tang conflict in the 8th century, Tang maintains control over most of Goguryeo northern territories in Manchuria, while Shilla maintains control over most of the Korean peninsula, just slightly shy south of the modern-day boundaries of Korea today, marking perhaps the first moment of a unified Korean peninsular identity. This also marks the first time a southern Korean kingdom reigns over the peninsula, with its capital of Seorabyol, modern-day Gyeongju, in the southeastern corner of Korea. Hyegong of Shilla, the 36th monarch, ascends the throne at the age of 8. Records from his court describe his peculiar reign as one of a man by appearance, but a woman by behavior. Many throughout the kingdom deem him unfit to rule, and eventually, high official Kim Dae-gong leads a rebellion against the 22-year-old king and slays him in 780 AD. Kim Yang-sang, an 11th generation descendant of King Ne-mul, making him an excellent candidate based on his bone ranking, ascends the throne. In Shilla culture, only those with high status in the bone ranking system, Golpum-jedo, are recognized to fill royal and aristocratic positions. This is perhaps the equivalent to royal blood in other cultures, but encompasses not only the royal family, but also anyone of any political standing. This means there is a built-in caste system at the aristocratic level, where merit often plays little to no role in deciding who joins the elite class. In contrast, in the burgeoning Tang dynasty, all citizens are permitted to take the imperial service examination to earn a position as a government official, which fosters a merit-based political system. Many historians believe that the rigidity of Shilla's bone-ranking system helped contribute to the weakening of the state. One famous example is Cho Chi-wan, who following an illustrious career in China, returns to Shilla only to frustratingly see his attempts at administrative reform rebuffed by an entrenched aristocracy. After the fall of Shilla, the bone-ranking system is abolished entirely. Shilla also plays a major role in re-promoting the indigenous culture of Korea. Prior to its rise in power, Korea is mostly dominated by Gojoseon and Goguryeo, both kingdoms that hold much closer cultural ties and influence from China. Although Shilla would eventually go on to adopt Buddhism as the national religion, it preserves many of its shamanist and animalist elements within new Buddhist festivals and traditions. So intertwined is shamanism with Shilla's culture and politics that one of its early kings, Namhae of Shilla's official title is Cha-chang, meaning shaman in Old Korean, perhaps something comparable to the relationship between Christianity and state in medieval Europe with the Pope ruling the Holy Roman Empire. As Shilla continues to weaken, Baekje is revived by General Gyeon Hwan and is known as later Baekje in its former lands of southwest Korea. In the north, Goguryeo is revived by the Buddhist monk Gongye. The kingdom is renamed to Majin in 904 AD and Taebong in 911 AD. Gongye is unstable and cruel. He proclaims himself Buddha, claims to read minds, and executes numerous subordinates and family members out of paranoia. Later, Goguryeo, also known as Taebong, is overthrown from within in 918 AD by Wonggyeon, a prominent general of noble Goguryeo descent, who establishes Goryeo in its place. Goryeo is the direct translation of Korea's Western exonym. With Tang China reaching the final chapters of its reign, its control over Manchuria and northern Korea weakens. Wang has his focus set northward, with one of his first decrees being to repopulate and defend the ancient Goguryeo capital of Pyongyang, which has been in ruins for years. His ambitions do not stop there, as he regards Goryeo as the successor to Goguryeo and seeks to reconquer all of Manchuria. Back in Baekje, the kingdom begins emerging as the new dominant force in Korea. Their focus under King Gyeon Hwan is on destroying their former rulers in Shilla. They sacked the Shilla capital, Gyeongju, in 927 AD, forcing the Shilla king to commit suicide and installing their own puppet government, becoming the de facto rulers of Shilla. Wang Gyeon of Goryeo is magnanimous towards his former rulers and attempts to defend Shilla from Baekje invasion, but suffers defeat in his attempts. Meanwhile, a kingdom in southern Manchuria, previously northern Goguryeo lands called Balhae, exists at the peripheries of the Three Kingdoms era of Korea. Balhae is conquered by the Khitan Liao dynasty, a powerful nomadic kingdom. Wang Gyeom, having descended from Goguryeo royalty, views the Balhae as Goryeo's lost brethren from the time of Goguryeo. He welcomes Balhae noble refugees and offers them marriage proposals and land grants. This influx of Balhae refugees, believed to have been in the hundreds of thousands over the course of 2 centuries, dramatically alters the demographics of Korea. Goguryeo populations increase relative to the southern Shilla and Baekje ethnic groups, displacing much of Korea's southern indigenous cultures with more nomadic and Sinified cultures of northern Korea, northeast China, and Manchuria. Wang Gyeon of Goryeo relishes several decisive victories over Baekje and shifts the balance of power on the peninsula. With Baekje power faltering, a power struggle erupts, and Gyeonhwan is deposed by his eldest son. He manages to escape to Goguryeo and is deferentially received by his former arch-rival Won Gyeon. Together, Gyeonhwan and Wang Gyeon rally 87,500 soldiers. Shilla capitulates and is annexed peacefully in 935, and later Baekje is defeated in battle in 936, marking an end to the Three Kingdoms period of Korea. Goryeo proceeds in peacefully absorbing the ruling class of Balhae, Baekje, and Shilla, incorporating them under its bureaucracy, conducting political marriages and distributing positions according to their previous statuses in their respective kingdoms. In contrast to Shilla's bone rank system, these open policies implemented by Wang Gyeon enables Goryeo to enjoy a larger pool of highly skilled bureaucrats and technicians. This also accelerates the cultural and ethnic homogeneity in Korea, bridging the divide between the different ethnic groups that had previously fought each other for centuries. While Shilla achieved political unification of Korea, it did not see quite the same level of success in achieving cultural and ethnic unification. Throughout the later Shilla era, Baekje and Goguryeo people still maintained strong independent cultural identities and generally held resentment towards their Shilla rulers. This fact is backed clearly by the re-emergence of these two kingdoms as soon as Shilla began to weaken in the 8th and 9th centuries. Viewing the Khitans of Liao as enemies of their kin, the Balhae, Wang Gyeon despises Liao and views them as savage beasts that should be guarded against. In 942 AD, the Liao dynasty sends 30 envoys with 50 camels as a gesture of goodwill towards Goryeo. Wang responds by exiling the envoys to an island and starves the camels under a bridge, in what is known as the Manbu Bridge Incident. The Khitans, super salty about their wasted 50 dead camels, invade in 993 AD. The Koreans are defeated in their first encounter with the Khitans, but successfully defend against them at the Cheongcheon River. Goryeo attempts to negotiate and enters into a nominal tributary relationship with Liao, severing relations with Song China, and Liao accepts and concedes the lands east of the Yalu River to Goryeo. The Koreans in 994, still viewing the Khitans as barbarian savages, proposes to Song China a joint military attack on Liao, but is declined. Perhaps out of spite, as in 985, Goryeo had declined Song's offer of an alliance against Liao. Fortunately for the Koreans though, for over a decade, Goryeo and Liao enjoy an amicable relationship with numerous royal intermarriages and alliances. In 1010 AD, Emperor Shengzong of Liao ends the relative peace by leading an invasion of Goryeo with an army of 400,000 soldiers. The Goryeo army suffers heavy casualties and is dispersed, and many commanders are captured or killed. Pyongyang is successfully defended, but the Liao army sacks Kaesong. Hyungjong of Goryeo sues for peace, with a promise that he will pay homage in person to the Liao emperor, and the Khitans, who are sustaining attacks from the regrouped Korean army, accepts and begins their withdrawal. However, facing poor weather conditions and disrupted supply lines, the Khitans are ceaselessly attacked during their withdrawal and face heavy casualties. Afterward, Hyunjong does not fulfill his promise to pay homage to the Liao Emperor. In the final campaign, Liao attempts to retake Kaesong, but this time are repelled and forced to regroup and resupply their army. The retreating Liao army is intercepted and suffers a major defeat, with only a few thousand soldiers escaping. Severely crippled, Liao never attempts to invade Goryeo again. Following the Goryeo-Khitan War, a balance of power is established in East Asia between Goryeo, Liao, and Song. Like Goguryeo generations prior, Goryeo enters into a golden age where Korea may have stood as a peer and rival of the powerful Song dynasty of China. Song regarded Goryeo as a potential military ally and maintained friendly relations as equal allies. Meanwhile, Liao sought to build closer ties with Goryeo to prevent a Song-Goryeo military alliance by appealing to Goryeo's infatuation with Buddhism and offers Liao Buddhist knowledge and artifacts to Goryeo. During the 11th century, Goryeo is viewed as the state that could give either the Song or the Liao military ascendancy. When imperial envoys, who represent the emperors of Liao and Song, travel to Goryeo, they are received as peers, not suzerains. Goryeo's golden age lasts about 100 years into the early 12th century and is a period of commercial, intellectual, and artistic achievement. The Goryeosa records the arrival of merchants from Arabia in 1024, 1025, and 1040, and hundreds of merchants from Song each year beginning in the 1030s. There are developments in printing and publishing, spreading the knowledge of philosophy, literature, religion, and science. Goryeo prolifically publishes and imports books, and by the 11th century begins exporting books to China. The Song dynasty is recorded to have transcribed thousands of Korean books. The reign of King Munjong from 1046 to 1083 is called the Reign of Peace, and is considered the most prosperous and peaceful period in Goryeo history. The fragmented Khitans begin migrating south into Goryeo to escape the Mongol horde. With nowhere to retreat to, the Khitans have their backs against the wall and once again become a formidable threat to Korea. However, Goryeo eventually allies with the Mongols and together defeat their common enemy in the Khitan invaders in Pyongan province. This alliance is short-lived, of course, as the Mongols are less interested in equal alliances and more interested in submissive vassals as their armies begin expanding throughout Eurasia. Ogedei Khan of the Mongols invades Goryeo in 1232 AD. There are 10 major campaigns between 1231 to 1258 at tremendous cost to civilian lives throughout the Korean peninsula. Exhausted morally and financially after decades of fighting, Goryeo sends Crown Prince Wonjong to the Yuan capital to swear allegiance to the Mongols. Kublai Khan accepts and marries one of his daughters to the Korean Crown Prince. For their surrender and allegiance, Goryeo, in contrast to Song China, is treated more like an inner Asian power. The Korean dynasty is allowed to survive, and intermarriage with Mongols is encouraged, even with the Mongol imperial family. For 80 years, nearly all Goryeo kings and royal men are required to marry Mongol princesses to ensure peace. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol Yuan dynasty is beginning to crumble, soon to be replaced by the Ming dynasty in 1368 AD. King Gongmin begins efforts to reform the Goryeo government and remove Mongolian influences. Ming China demands that the territories of the former Sangseong prefectures be handed over to China. The tract of land was taken by Mongol forces during the invasion of Korea, but had been reclaimed by Goryeo in 1356 AD as the Yuan dynasty weakened. The demand causes an uproar among the Goryeo court, who are divided into two conflicting factions, one supporting the Ming and the other standing by the weakening Mongol Yuan. In 1388 AD, King Wu, infuriated by the Ming demand to hand over Goryeo land, plans a campaign to invade present-day Liaoning of China. King Wu enlists the help of General Yi Seong-gye, but General Yi stops at the border and mutinies against the king. The army turns back east. Goryeo falls to the general, who puts to death the last three Goryeo kings. The Goryeo kingdom has come to an end after 474 years of rule. Yi Seong-gye contemplated two possibilities for the name of the new dynasty: Hwaryong and Joseon. After much internal deliberation, as well as endorsement by the neighboring Ming dynasty's emperor, Yi declares the name of the kingdom to be Joseon, a tribute to the ancient Korean state of Gojoseon. The capital moves from Gaeyeong to Hanseong, near modern-day Seoul. Sejong the Great, the fourth monarch of Joseon, is a noteworthy king in Korea's history, as he is most remembered for his creation of Hangul, the Korean alphabet, in 1443 AD. Rejected in its time by the scholarly elite, everyday use of Hangul in writing would take until the later half of the 20th century to fully replace Hanja, and is today the official written language of Korea. Sejong creates Hangul to make writing and reading more accessible to common people. Its phonetic nature arguably allows for easier literacy compared to the Chinese Hanja, a logographic language where symbols represent entire words without relating to pronunciation. On top of its practicality, Hangul plays a pivotal role in the formation and preservation of Korean national identity. It is designed specifically for the Korean language, unlike Hanja. The creation of Hangul symbolizes a break from the cultural and linguistic influence of China and asserts Korea's distinct identity in the academic fields. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Japan enters into the Sengoku era, where it sees nearly 2 centuries of civil and political upheaval and uprisings throughout the islands, causing Japan to militarize significantly. Japanese samurai and daimyo Toyotomi Hideyoshi, plotting the conquest of Ming China, invades the mainland through Korea. Factional division in the Joseon court, inability to assess Japanese military capability, and failed attempts at diplomacy lead to poor preparation for the invasion. Ming China intervenes on the side of the Koreans, sending a large force in 1593, which ultimately ends Toyotomi's campaign. Not before Joseon's population, economy, and military is devastated by the invasion. Korea and China, while by no means pacifist cultures, often view Japan as a land of warmongers, pirates, and backward culture. Kang Hong, a Korean aristocrat taken hostage during the Imjin War, is quoted,
"Look at this repugnant place, where teeth are blackened. These slit-eyed ones are genuinely of a different race. This is not a place yet graced by King Yu's influence."
This leads us into the 5th reason for Korea's ability to maintain its cultural independence. China's incentive to maintain Korean sovereignty as a buffer zone between China and Japan. During the Ming Dynasty, Japanese piracy is a major issue for China, but Korean shorelines and waters suffer the brunt of Japanese attacks given their proximity to Japan. Japanese desires to invade China are also most viable via land through the Korean peninsula. This allows Ming China significant time while Japanese forces travel through Korea to mount their defenses while leaving Korea to suffer most of the devastation brought by the invasions. The Jurchen tribes of Manchuria, who would later rename themselves Manchus under the Qing dynasty, unify under the powerful chieftain Nurhaci. Conflict inevitably erupts between the growing Manchu power and Ming China. Both sides desperately reach out to Joseon for alliance against the other. The Korean populace, not forgetting Ming's intervention in Japan's invasion a generation prior, deposes the neutral-leaning king Gwanghae-gun and replaces him with Injo of Joseon, an outspoken supporter of the Ming Empire. In response, the Manchu Qing Emperor Hong Taiji sends a punitive expedition of 120,000 men to Joseon in 1636 AD and defeats King Injo, who is painfully forced to end his relationship with the Ming and recognize the Qing as suzerain instead. Despite re-establishing economic relations by officially entering the Qing Imperial Chinese tributary system, Joseon leaders and intellectuals continue to regard the Manchus as barbarians and regard the Ming dynasty as the center of the civilized world. When the Ming are officially overthrown by the Qing, an influx of Ming refugees flee to Joseon. As a result, Joseon creates the Little China ideology, known as Sojong-hwa. This ideology holds that while other neighboring kingdoms succumb to the will of Qing barbarism, Joseon is a bastion of civility in the face of the barbarian domination of the civilized world. Joseon views itself as the legitimate successor to Ming China. Japan and Vietnam would, to lesser degrees, also share similar ideologies, having resisted Qing domination and preserved Ming values. A set of standardized rites and unifying symbols are developed in late Joseon in order to maintain the sense of cultural identity. Long after submitting to the Qing, the Joseon court and many Korean intellectuals continue using Ming reign periods in subtle defiance against the Qing dynasty. With all that we've covered, we move on to our 5th and final reason for Korea's ability to maintain its independent identity: tribute. Korea throughout its history at times rivals that of even the most powerful of Chinese and nomadic empires, relishing countless victories over its adversaries. However, when Korea stands at a disadvantage, they have a knack for knowing when to submit. Offering tribute and submitting to becoming a vassal state saves Korea from head-on wars they know they cannot win, and on countless occasions avoids or delays invasions from Khitans, Jurchens, Mongols, Han, Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing armies. If we know anything about history, it's that no nation ever sits at the top of the hill indefinitely. Knowing when to submit to avoid unfavorable confrontation is an invaluable skill that, when lacking, has been the downfall of an innumerable number of nations throughout time. Koreans live true to the expression, choose your battles wisely. Japan, after the Meiji Restoration, acquires Western military technology and forces Joseon to sign the Treaty of Ganghwa, opening 3 ports to trade and granting the Japanese extraterritoriality. In 1894 AD, the Donghak Peasant Revolution sees farmers rise up in mass rebellion, with peasant leader Jeon Bong-jun defeating the forces of local rulers at the Battle of Gobu in 1894 AD. Jeonju is overtaken by the peasants, and the Joseon government asks the Qing dynasty for assistance in ending the revolt. The Qing send 3,000 troops, and the Japanese, viewing this as a threat, respond by dispatching 8,000 troops of their own, seizing the royal palace in Seoul and installing a pro-Japanese government on June 8, 1894. This soon escalates into war between Japan and the Qing Empire, fought largely in Korea. King Gojong assumes the title of emperor in order to assert Korea's independence. Technically, 1897 AD marks the end of the Joseon period, as the official name of the empire is changed to the Empire of Korea. After the signing of the Protectorate Treaty in 1905, Korea becomes a protectorate of Japan. In 1910 AD, the Japanese Empire finally annexes Korea, ending the royal line of succession and bringing an end to over 2,000 years of dynastic Korean history. Now that we've covered much of Korea's history, we can begin to piece together how all its events, attributes, and people contributed to its surviving identity. Truly a remarkable feat when you consider how many similarly cultured people were ultimately engulfed by neighboring countries. The Jurchens, Manchus, Balhae, and Khitans are all but a few of the many tribal kingdoms that shared similar cultures and origins to the Koreans, but ultimately lost much of their cultural identity when China entered into the modern era, where ethnic homogeneity became a prerogative to the survival of the Chinese Republic governments of the 20th century, clouding much ethnic diversity in the region under the prevailing ideal of a united Han Chinese nation. Korea throughout history played a masterful role at walking the fine line between adversary, ally, and vassal to avoid a similar fate. Though subjugated at various points to varying degrees, the Korean identity managed against all odds not only to survive, but thrived into the present day. Thanks so much for watching, but listen, while I enjoyed making this video, it's a tremendous commitment of time and effort as I'm a one-man show. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking and subscribing so I can continue making more content.